Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of From the Lighthouse. Once again, I'd like to say hello to my lovely co-host Michelle. Hi Michelle.
Hi Stephanie.
So today we've got a special guest with us, and for the first time it's actually one of our students. We have Bodhi Biles here to talk to us today. Hi Bodhi.
Hi everyone.
So the reason that we asked Bodhi to come and speak to us today is because we're looking at 13 Reasons Why, the recent Netflix adaptation of the novel by J. Asher. And since Michelle and I sadly no longer teenagers and haven't been teenagers for quite some time, we thought we would invite an actual youth to talk about this series. So, Bodhi, can you tell us a bit about why 13 Reasons Why is so popular at the moment? What's going on?
Well, do you know kind of the premise of what it's about?
I know the premise, but yeah, maybe if you could speak to why it's...
Oh, look, I have 2 out of 3 children who have watched all episodes.
You're surrounded by youth.
I am surrounded by youth, and in fact my 18... Well, I shouldn't actually say that because he won't want to be identified, but he may have stayed up until 5 in the morning.
I relate. I stayed up until about 3:30 in the morning, and I kind of watched all 13 hours of it straight. And then kind of paid for it dearly when I woke up the next day. But no, like, I think the series is quite... it's interesting because people are reacting to it very distinctly, either very positively or very negatively. And I think that's because it's relatable either way. So, for example, the people reacting to it negatively, they may relate to it in such a personal way that it brings up a lot of unspoken issues for them. Or they may not relate to it at all, so they're ignoring the issues because it's an uncomfortable conversation. Mm-hmm. And then people relating to it positively, is again, it's that variant of how deeply they're relating to it or not.
Because I guess for people who don't know 13 Reasons Why, just a little bit of a brief recap in terms of the premise of the story.
Yeah.
It very much sort of deals with teenage suicide in an actually fairly graphic manner, from what I understand.
In the series,
okay,
not
so
in the book.
That's it. But so
there's a lot of changes in the book as opposed to the series.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess there's also that notion of some form of blame in terms of sort of 13 cassettes, which I thought is interesting because obviously cassettes are a technology that belong to my... I actually did grow up with cassettes. Yeah. So, could you just a little bit more about that?
I mean, well, the premise is basically it follows Hannah Baker. So there's 2 protagonists, Hannah Baker and Clay Jensen. And Clay comes home one day to find a box, and it's full of the cassette tapes. And Hannah has basically recorded 13 reasons why she has committed suicide. And each tape is dedicated to a different person who has contributed to this snowball effect that led her to kill herself. Some tapes, for example, 2 people get 2 separate tapes, or one person gets 2 tapes. It depends on what role they play in the story. Mm-hmm. So I think, and again, going back to why I think people are reacting to it the way they are, talking about mental health in general has such a stigma attached to it, but when you're relating it to teenagers and adolescents and kind of this youth, and you're talking about very harsh topics like, for example, rape, suicide, it really is an uncomfortable conversation that people don't want to bring up.
Yes, I'm obviously thinking in terms of the way that traditionally sort of, I guess, ideas like suicide, rape, in mental illness in relationship to sort of teenage people have been handled, and I guess censorship is really strong around those issues, isn't there? Like there's a sense that the way of dealing with them is by not having that sort of material as part of,
believing that youth can't experience something traumatic, or at least traumatic enough to lead them to a breakdown like that, or believing that, youth is still innocent when the reality is it's not. But I think socially we idealize adolescence and youth, and people talk about, high school is the best time of my life and this, that and everything, but then a book like this which shows actually no it's not, and it hasn't been like that for a very long time,
or actually I think ever, and I think that was one of the things that I was thinking was that that sort of overhang is very much a Victorian notion of innocence.
That's
it?
Right. Yeah,
that's a craft. It's the construction of childhood as a time of innocence.
Yeah.
And at a time then that children need to be sheltered, or maybe more specifically teenagers, to kind of use a more modern conceptualization, but that they need to be kind of sheltered from all of these topics, that just touching these topics in the literature that they read or the TV they watch, I suppose, is going to infect them somehow.
Yeah, and as a writer, and I write a lot of young adult fiction, I'm always kind of policing what I should write, because whether it's considered appropriate or not for teenagers, but then I kind of think, well, I was a teenager and it was appropriate for me. Most teenagers that I know are kind of discussing these issues anyway, so whose perception is saying...
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that what's going on here is our kind of... We're pointing to what we understand that period of your life to be like. And I think that a lot of people would conceptualise, especially being a teenager, as a time when you're very susceptible to the media that you consume, that it's going to have a kind of stronger effect on you psychologically than as an adult. And whether that's true or not, I think, is a really open question. I think for some teenagers that they are quite susceptible for various reasons, but a lot of teenagers aren't.
Yeah.
And teenagers are still capable of reading critically. Just because you read something doesn't mean you're going to do it necessarily.
Exactly, and that's one of the biggest criticisms of the show at the moment. When Headspace came out and slammed the show and said, it might inspire younger people to, commit suicide, and we've had our suicide hotlines kind of going off the rails with concerned parents and teenagers and, psychologists and doctors and this, that, and everything. But, again, it's this idea that, this is a reality for some people. Mm-hmm. But I have never really, for me personally, I've never read a story that makes me go, I'm going to kind of embody this text.
Yeah, that I'm going to act in the ways that these texts kind of models.
Yeah.
Or even that it is that sort of straightforward identification process. And I guess, because I think you're always mindful of the fact that literature plays that role of giving anyone, whether it's a child, an adult, man, woman, whatever it is, I guess, and I can't remember the name of the philosopher, but their second body, and if you can't actually see yourself being portrayed anywhere, then in actual fact it's harmful.
Yeah,
so
and it's isolating.
Not portraying these sorts of issues, I think, could be as
more damaging?
Equally damaging as sort of...
Yeah, and that's what a lot of people who are reacting positively to it are saying, where it's just like, oh my god, me too. I can finally relate to something. I've related to how that feels. They obviously they haven't gone and killed themselves, but they're like, I relate to, for example, the rumours going around school, or I relate to when someone kind of, for a female student, I relate to when a male kind of touched me inappropriately and I didn't want it. That relatability.
And that can be very reassuring. I think.
And makes you feel like you're not alone. Someone's validating you. Someone's actually saying, no, this was something that shouldn't happen. You shouldn't just ignore it. So one of the main criticisms that I want to kind of bring up is a lot of people are saying that, particularly with the show, because in the book, Hannah Baker commits suicide by swallowing pills, and it has about a page that talks about it, and it's Clay's reflections on it by saying, oh, some people said you drowned in the bathtub, some people said this, some people said that.
So it's not graphic.
It's not graphic in the least sense, as well as the rape scene, because it's not even a rape scene in this, from Hannah's perspective. She's like, I didn't tell you to stop, I didn't say anything like that. And it was very interesting. I'll see if I can find it in here. But it was basically saying she wanted to use... knowing that she would be sexually assaulted because of the type of person that the character Bryce is, she wanted to use that to kind of lose herself completely and lose all her identity and lose all kind of self-worth, which would kind of prompt her or push her even further to actually kill herself.
So she's being very self-destructive in the book.
Yeah.
An agency.
And that's
sort of agency.
Not the same thing that happens in the series, because that is a graphic rape scene. Actually, there's 2 graphic rape scenes in it.
And the suicide in the scene.
And the
series
suicide in it is completely different, where she slashes her wrists.
Which is actually
and
done
then it's very, very graphic.
Confronting.
And that's one of people's biggest issues with it. They're saying, oh, it's very triggering for people, it might inspire people, but my kind of bounce back to that, or clap back to that, is, those things don't happen until episode 12 and 13. Before they happen, the specific episode says, warning, this will show graphic depictions of rape, or this will show graphic depictions of suicide. And then, so you've had to kind of subject yourself to watching 12 hours to get there, and you kind of know the premise as well. But then in saying that, so I don't think, personally, and this is my own opinion, I don't think it will inspire someone to kind of take action like that. It might exacerbate someone's
but it's also a really
symptoms.
Problematic idea of responsibility and blame to presume that sort of a person who is otherwise not going to kill themselves will over So I think that that actually leads me to one of the things that intrigued me about the not enough to get me to watch it, but it did actually intrigue me in my grilling of my children. And the thing that struck me was that both of them very clearly said that they took from that series a very strong sense that suicide was never the answer, because as a reader, as a viewer, you take that sense of that you can't get.
And you also see
back.
the aftermath of it as well. Do you see the effect that it has on the parents? You see the effect, and especially because this story is kind of vengeful, with the tapes. And she's like, "I'm going to try to ruin your mentality," basically. And she says some of you might not change your attitudes at all, but some of you might go to jail. And so it's very vengeful, her thinking before even committing suicide.
Well, the thing that I found interesting, and that I'd be interested to hear your perspective on, was that my daughter, who's 14, actually said that first of all, because I said the same thing, it is very vengeful, and her conclusions were that firstly they deserved it. So they unproblematically A, deserved the tape, and B, to feel guilty about killing her, and C, that they caused her death. And that for me, that I guess is one of the criticisms that's being levelled at it. That whereas somebody, and you're much older, and you've had a lot more experience with reading and writing and critiquing and all of that.
I think if I watched this as a teenager, it would have been very different how I reacted to it, because I'm not kind of critically tearing it apart. But no, I definitely think that, for example, in the book, when she does kill herself, again, it's that really graphic thing, but all the characters, she's very kind of, for example, Clay Jensen, when it gets to his tape, which is tape number 9 or something, but the way that the tapes have been spread around is very different than what it is in the book. But when it gets to his tape, he's kind of gone through 9 tapes so far, 9 episodes of believing that he's the reason she killed herself, or he's played a big part. And she literally says, "Clay, you shouldn't be on these tapes, but I'm going to tell you why you're on there." And it was along the lines of, at a party he kissed her and she told him to get away from her, and he tried to come back and then she said get away, and then he left and he didn't come back, and that's kind of her reasoning for him affecting her. And some of the reasonings for what happens, again, I understand that in a teenager's mind, and that's kind of something that I have to remind myself is this is a teenage character, so they don't have the same reflections as I would.
So are you saying that incident demonstrates or holds up for critique the flaws in her logic? Is that what you're saying? And that allow sort of viewers and an audience to recognise the fact that while in her mind she's making connections, joining dots, that the reader and the audience can see are not necessarily the only way that you could connect the dots, but also probably problematic.
And you like it. She does talk about a snowball effect, at least in the book that I remember. She talks about a snowball effect and how one thing led to another, led to another.
So therefore it's not a kind of, you did this, therefore I've committed suicide. It's a, these are small kind of
but she blames everyone on the way as well. So whether it is something small, she's like, you played a part because you kind of rolled that snowball at the top of the hill.
Yeah, and that kind of worries me, because I think that to take your life is an extreme act, obviously, and it kind of worries me that it's and again, I haven't seen the show or read the book, so I may be misinterpreting this, but it just worries me that it's promoting this idea of suicide as something motivated by the actions of others versus, I mean, to take your own life, you've obviously got some mental health issues that need to be worked out.
Yeah.
Because if you are entirely mentally healthy, nobody can do anything that will push you to that.
And that's what I mean about the criticisms of the show, where, for example, people are like, oh, we've had concerned parents and we've had this and we've had a lot more teenagers ringing our suicide hotlines, and I'm like, yeah, but the show didn't inspire them to that.
It was already there.
Yeah,
it was something that was already
and that's
in
what I
them.
mean about
Yeah.
exacerbating the symptoms that are already existing. So I would never recommend for someone who is in that mindset to watch the show. But someone who is in a much more kind of aware and healthy mindset would be able to watch the show and take something completely different from it. But then my other criticism is when, you know, they've said, oh, we've had a lot of people ring up our suicide hotlines and stuff. I'm kind of like, isn't that the point of them?
Yeah.
But maybe they've sought help rather than
like
taking their lives.
they're not living
so
in
if you had a
silence anymore.
spike, so if you'd had a spike of suicides, that's probably more problematic than a spike in calls, because that could actually be a good
because
thing.
the show kind of shows her trying to get, and the last kind of tape shows her going to a guidance counsellor, trying to get help, and she actually says, she insinuates, I feel suicidal, and she insinuates that she was raped, and the guidance counsellor's advice is kind of like, well, you just need to get over it and move on.
So
and
there's a real failure in systems,
Yeah, and that's kind of what, because she says even in the book, she's like, this is the last chance, I'm giving life one last chance. And then she records her conversation with the guidance counsellor, and then when he basically says, you either have one choice is to, for example, press charges, but she couldn't, because she couldn't kind of conceptualise what had happened either, or you need to let it go and move on. Needless to say, this happened very recently for her as well. And when she hears she need to let it go and move on, she interprets it as get over it, just move on with it. And she's like, all right, I'm just going to get over it and I'm going to move on with the suicide.
So therefore, because it does demonstrate, that the thing to do in those situations is to seek help, and yes, those systems sometimes fail, but in real life, people ringing suicide hotlines and seeking help is actually a positive thing. If people are talking about these issues,
they're not suffering in silence anymore.
Exactly.
It's not a matter of, suddenly all these people have watched the show and they all feel suddenly really triggered and they've realised they have, depressive mindsets and they're just like, oh, I better go seek help for it. It's the fact that these people have been suffering in silence. And again, it goes back to that relatability. Finally, that's how I feel, and I don't want to end up like that, so I'm going to go ring someone. I'm going to go seek help.
Well, I never thought of banning. I mean, I've never... I've never thought. Firstly, it's a ridiculous enterprise, because if they don't watch it under your roof, they'll watch it under someone else's.
Yeah.
And you can't.
That's red rag to a bull, isn't it?
And it just puts it in a context where it's no longer, where it no longer opens a dialogue. And the thing that I know is that, in actual fact, and I don't have statistics for this, but I do know for a fact that that most teenagers would know of someone who has either made an attempt on their life or who has killed themselves.
And if they haven't made an attempt on their life, they're at least suffering with, for example, depression, self-harm, any of these kind of self-destructive habits.
But that might also point to the reason why it's so graphic, because it seems to me that there's an interesting kind of disjunct there between the book and the kind of light way that it's dealt, the actual act is dealt with in the book versus the series. So you've got to think, why was that choice made? And I wonder if the reason it's graphic is not a kind of, exploitative, we're going to show violence because we can, and because it's TV and it might cause some controversy and get people to watch, but also because violence is off-putting, right? If it's so graphic and so disturbing, then teenagers are less likely to actually think that this is something to romanticize it. I remember seeing this is kind of very off topic but kind of related, I remember seeing a version of Madame Bovary an adaptation of the novel in which the main character at the end commits suicide, and it made the death look kind of pretty, because she didn't even really vomit, she poisons herself and she just sort of flails around and then dies. And then I remember seeing another adaptation of this in which she's violently vomiting and violently ill, and it made it look awful. And I thought,
Exactly,
I'd rather
though.
see suicide look awful than suicide look like...
And that's kind
romantic.
of what I liked about the series of it. Well, I didn't like it, but like what I thought was really effective is, you know, if she had just like, you know, taken some pills and laid down in
Fallen
the
asleep.
bathtub and
Yeah.
just like, oh, that's kind of the end
Looks
of
like
that
a good way
kind of thing.
out.
It's just like, oh, that was kind of almost peaceful.
Yeah. You
While
want,
like
you wanted
with
to
this,
see
you know,
violence.
she's
yeah.
there and she like, you know, digs the razor blade up her arm and blood spurts out and then she screams and she's crying and she does it again and then she's there in like a bloody bathtub and the parents run in and see her and like the mum's cradling her and crying and
And you can see
it's
how
so
destructive...
much more
yeah,
intense.
yeah, that's right.
And I can see how it would be triggering, but it depends on what people are still kind of choosing to focus on as well.
But I also think, you know, sort of just in a sort of a broader perspective, you know, sort of it draws attention to, first of all, the fact that we do have particular sort of constructions and normalisations going on around what it is to be a child and to be a proper child and to be a proper teenager, which means that you don't have these sorts of concerns. And I think that series like this as a sort of challenge those sorts of notions, but also hit raw nerves, because in actual fact any, you know, sort of any detrimental or destructive sort of thing that's going on in society is happening in families, it's happening behind closed doors, and children from, you know, sort of the time they're born to the time that they leave home are always going to be subjected to those realities, and to pretend that just because it's not happening in, you know, sort of this many houses, it's not happening in any houses, is always going to just, I think, intensify the sort of the experiences of alienation and marginalisation. And any time that sort of something does create a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, I think it's usually a sign that it's something that needs to happen, a dialogue that needs to happen, and not necessarily that Selena Gomez, you know, is actually necessarily, you know, sort of the person to do this, or that her motivations, or you know, or that the series itself is necessarily a match to things. But it is, I think,
but in
without a
saying
doubt.
that, Selena, for example, Selena Gomez's audience and the people who are receiving from it, well, aside from being enormous, but majority of it, you know, she grew up, she did Barney and then she did Disney, and
Which
she's
is a
kind of
Waverly
stayed very
Place.
PG for the most part. So her audience has always been youth. You know, you're not going to catch like your 70-year-old grandma, you know, bopping away just at a Selena Gomez. I mean, you might, but you wouldn't catch mine.
So she's speaking to...
and you know, if she's able to
audience.
use her fanfare to do that, I think it's really effective. And you know, even when the actors that play Hannah and Clay, they were on Ellen the other day, and even Ellen said, you know, she brought up the idea that it's really controversial, and she said, but the fact is, it's getting people actually talking about it, and I think that's the most important part of it.
Well, I mean, it's caught fire. You know, it's the biggest. Allegedly, Netflix have notoriously stingy at releasing their actual statistics, but allegedly, it is the most watched Netflix original television show of since they've been making them. So it's so discussed and so kind of in the public sphere that it has to be there for a reason. I was
I mean, even we're here talking about it, which kind of goes to show the hype around it.
Well, I was telling you earlier, Bodhi, that I sometimes intimately get newsletters from my old high school. I don't really know why, but I do. And I opened one last Friday, and the one page of the newsletter, of like a 4-page newsletter, so not a long newsletter, was entirely devoted to talking about how to talk to your children about 13 Reasons Why. So it's really cutting through whatever the merits of the show might be, and however kind of problematic that kind of revenge plot aspect of it is. It's obviously speaking to teenagers. I mean, teenagers won't watch things if they don't resonate with them.
Yeah, they're very kind of brutally honest and harsh.
Yeah.
Look, and I mean, I know that you know, I wish I had the sort of reference for this, but I actually remember attending a conference, and I think you might have been there too, Stephanie, where someone was talking about the way that at the point in it was to do with Thomas Hardy and Jude the Obscure, but at the point at which education was sort of made both sort of public and was you know, sort of reached a point where it was compulsory, was, you know, sort of the highest rate of child suicides. It was just it sort of ended up in this sort of situation where you know, sort of children, under the age of 12 were killing themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that there's this myth that we tell ourselves that, it's only this really nasty old, sort of 21st century world where kids have got these troubles that make them feel like they need to kill themselves, is a myth.
And I feel like that kind of ties into, sorry to cut you off, I feel like it kind of ties into that idea that, like, millennials, millennials have it so easy, and millennials I feel like millennials themselves have been marginalised, and that's the audience that this is now, which isn't me, so that makes me feel old.
They tend to get a lot of public flogging, as if they're this kind of narcissistic, selfish,
and just like, and while I'm kind of like, well, who raised the millennials kind of thing, but you know what I mean. But then I'm also like, every generation kind of gets the previous generation saying that about them.
Yeah, and I mean, when I was at school in the 90s, and I knew unfortunately many people who took their own lives. It's not something that is something that's just a thing now. Yeah. But the thing is, though, then nobody really talked about it. It was very much, it happened, and we all knew about it happening, and there was always, rumours about it happening, but nobody ever really discussed it, and there wasn't a lot of visibility of mental health issues at the time.
I remember it was discussed quite a lot in my school, actually. In the later year, like when I was in like year 11 and year 12, but that was when we were also studying alienation, isolation, belonging, and everything like that. But the reason we were talking about it so much was because that was when cyberbullying became a big thing, because Facebook only came out midway through high school for me, but that was when cyberbullying became such a massive thing, and people were kind of obsessed with hating on each other, but also obsessed with reading the hate they were receiving, and they took it really personally. Because I remember studying, for example, Megan Meyer, who was a girl whose ex-boyfriend, or some friend's mother, pretended to be a guy online, led her on for months and told her to kill herself, and egged her on, and then she ended up killing herself, kind of thing. So, I think it's changed, but in a way, I feel like anything that's going to have any pushback is something that needs to be discussed, as Stephanie said.
Well, Jimmy has just alerted me to the fact that from all of my confidence that in my day we didn't really talk about these issues as openly, Looking for Ella Brandy, which we will be dealing with in an upcoming podcast, actually has a suicide in it.
Yeah.
Now, it's not the main character. You don't see any of the kind of mental torment that goes on for this character, in terms of, he's very much a secondary character. But it does happen.
Yeah.
And I remember it being somewhat controversial that it happened at all. But again, it was sort of conceptualized as like this inexplicable thing that a character did that was a tragedy. And obviously that is true. But I don't think... Juliet. Yeah, but I don't think it was kind of... talked about in the way that 13 Reasons Why has been talked about. Yeah. I don't remember anybody sitting down and talking to me about how to cope with that scene.
I think part of that has to do with the internet, though, because everything just has a mind of its own on the internet. Like, for example, last night, the person who broke the record, this guy broke the record for the most retweeted tweet ever, and it was about chicken nuggets from Wendy's. Like, he overtook Ellen and Ellen's famous Oscar selfie and everything.
Well,
so
I think
the internet provides that wildfire track.
Well, also
them.
Because you can find people easier. Like in my day, if you particularly, if I had picked up 13 Reasons Why as a teenager, if it was around when I was a teenager, and I particularly, found it interesting, I would probably talk about it with my friends, but that's it. Whereas now you can go online and you can talk about it with many, many millions of people.
Yep.
And
have fights with everyone.
And have these conversations. These conversations are magnified because of the internet. Whereas in my day, it would be like, okay, I read this book. Did you read it? Oh yeah, I thought it was interesting, and then that would be kind of it.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's the propensity. I mean, the very word viral. It really only has. But it really only has sort of currency and meaning in sort of this very technologically saturated world that we live in. Because I have to say, I was just in a reverie thinking back to the fact that the only very oblique discussion we had about mental illness when I was at school in the 80s was it was under the self-esteem. Self-esteem, and I think that what they were doing in their own very subtle way was actually talking about, sort of people who may have had self-esteem issues, but of course it wasn't. It was just very, very obliquely treated, and I don't think any one of us in the class had any sense of why we were being subjected to these self-esteem discussions.
I remember we had a lot of self-esteem discussions too, but certainly nothing it was never conceptualized as mental illness or what to do if somebody is experiencing symptoms or seeking counselling or whatever. It was very much a, feel good about yourself, girls, because I went to an all-girls school, feel like you can do anything you want to do. It wasn't conceptualised in the way it is today.
I think, I've spoken to people who are older than me, and they talk about how, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying about millennials kind of being the public, beating.
Yeah.
But they were saying, people these days are so sensitive, and back in my day, we just didn't do that. Like, if you bullied someone, it was fine because that was... But I'm like, was it though? How can you, one, speak for someone else's experiences, but two, again, and this kind of draws into another point that I want to talk about is, I want to kind of talk about, I wonder how this would have been received if it was in a different modality, in the sense that, Netflix and binge watching and that whole trend, if this was something like where it was coming out by week, would it have been different?
That's interesting, isn't it? Because we tend to... And
I think it would be very different, and I don't think it would be nearly as successful. I think it's something that kind of needs to be binge-watched. Even the way the book's written, it doesn't... as a writer, I was kind of horrified. But, it doesn't... Even when the chapter breaks happen, which are the tapes, the way the chapter ends is just... And then I flip the tape over, and then we go again.
Yeah.
There's no real sense of break. There's no real kind of easing up on it. And it's very interesting, the timing difference between the book and the show, because in the show it seems to go on for at least a week or two. Mm-hmm. In the book it goes for one night. The entire thing, and he's walking around the streets and following this map that Hannah has to kind of... But it also in the book, which is kind of what I didn't like, was there was no character interaction between... And I know that, being kind of a visual text, you need other stuff on there.
Yeah.
I imagine on a technical level they actually had to enact the cassettes, because it is... and that's what I kept questioning my daughter about. I said, what, so what, they're just sitting in a room listening to cassettes?
Some of them
Who has a cassette player anymore?
Did you know that this was set in my era? Did you know what to do with a cassette?
But even in the series, I thought it was hilarious, because, he steals... Clay steals Tony's cassette player, which is his friend, and listens to it, and takes forever to listen to it, to the point the other people on the tapes are like, why haven't you just listened to them yet? I listened to them in one night and you're taking forever, kind of thing. But I think it depends on how they're listening to it too, because, the premise is that she's also handed over a map that has different locations X'd out, and it's like, this, location correlates with tape 1, this one correlates with tape 5, this one is where the party was, this one's this. And so Clay decides to follow all these things around.
And so that's where the difference in the series, because you can get that kind of visualised versus, the experience of listening.
It's very interesting, and I was talking about it to you, Stephanie, before, where I wonder what the reaction to it is, depending on which way people consume it first. So if they've read the book, how do they view the Netflix series? Because I watched the series first before reading the book, so I think the book is awful by comparison. But I wonder if people think the series is awful by comparison.
And I think that's an interesting question about that binge watching culture and that kind of hype that comes out when you consume something in that, almost feverish way versus,
because you can.
You just
I wonder what it would be like if it was, one episode and then you had to kind of wait. And, in we had to do in the old days.
I kind of, I like that now with, for example, The Walking Dead, where it is all RuPaul's Drag Race or any shows that I watch, where it is still, one episode a week, and I'm like, it feels like I actually have a life again.
But it also, you can kind of, I think when you do binge something in that kind of really intense way, I think you can kind of get obsessed in ways that you couldn't
and almost
before.
Oversaturated.
Yeah.
Which is why, for example, people who are reacting to this so negatively, I'm like, how much did you kind of expose yourself to, and how consistently? Because by the end of 13 hours, I was done myself.
Yeah.
3:30 in the morning, I was just no, tapping out.
Especially because it's such kind of, it's extreme, disturbing content. It's not like a fun kind of happy
and that's
comedy.
Where it ends as well.
Yeah, that's right.
So to kind of get there when you are so kind of drained and exhausted, and you kind of haven't eaten all day, and then you kind of get that image in your face, it makes it even more confronting, I think. So I think they've almost played on the idea of binge watching
Yeah, that kind of compulsion to keep going and to
Yeah.
find out the answer. And because you know what's going to happen from the beginning, don't you? You know that she's going to commit suicide.
it says, like, and that's kind of why I don't really agree with people who are like, oh, this is really kind of disturbing, in the sense that her first words were almost, hi, it's Hannah Baker. Yes, the Hannah Baker who killed herself. And it says, even in the little kind of description info, this story follows the story of Hannah Baker who committed suicide. So I'm like, you know what you're kind of getting into.
So it's very kind of explicit about. There's no shocks. It's not like you get to the end of episode 13 and
No,
you're like,
you're definitely
I'm
expecting it.
Yeah.
But in saying that, it's still graphic and it's still kind of confronting as it is.
Oh, of course.
But that's because of the visual kind of idea of it. I feel like in the novel, even if they wrote that she, slit her wrists and everything else, it would not have been portrayed the same way as it was graphically on the screen.
It's kind of a macabre fascination, isn't it? Because, as you say, you know the ending, and it's just that compulsion to get there, which does actually rely quite heavily upon the audience's predilection for that sort of thing. It actually does sort of say quite a lot about.
It kind of makes you feel like you have your own tape, if I'm honest, because we're kind of personified or focalized through Clay for the most part. So where he's constantly obsessed with, I need to get to my tape, I need to get to my tape. So it's almost like we're just like, we need to get to the tapes, we just need to find the tapes.
And it's almost set up like a crime drama,
Yeah.
In that you know that the ending, like you do in a crime drama, you know that there's been a crime, and you're finding out how you got there.
Yeah.
So there is a kind of it's a very kind of familiar genre over this, and who is also going to be the kind of most responsible. Who is going to be the catalyst? The murderer. Yeah.
It's a perverse.
And I would say Bryce.
Well,
to be honest.
Well, I mean, it is a kind of perverse murder mystery in a way.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so therefore it's appealing to one of the most popular genres that there is, which is the crime mystery. Although it is a very different kind of crime mystery. Kind of
sort of an externalized psychological exploration, isn't it? Because you're sort of on one and the same time exploring what her own personal motivations are through the externalization of these sort of these scenes, these characters, and so it is a strange tension, isn't there, between being inside and outside of the victim's mind.
I'm very intrigued because it just got announced a couple of days ago that they're doing season 2 of it.
Yeah, how are they going to do a season 2?
Yeah, I'm very intrigued what they're going to do with that. Because I'm like, there's no kind of novel afterwards to kind of go on with. But then Jay Asher also kind of gave their blessing and was like, yes, I'd love a season 2 as well.
Yeah, it kind of worries me. The part that worries me is not necessarily the depiction of suicide, graphic as it may be. And all of these things don't bother me, but I am bothered by the revenge plot element. That's what really, really bothers me. I just think that, first of all, it doesn't, from what I understand of people with suicidal ideation, it doesn't really line up with those kinds of ways of thinking about what prompts a person to commit suicide, and it also feels to me very nasty.
Well, but it also normalises. If you have it sort of normalises, because that was the thing that worried me about my daughter's reaction. Yes, they deserve to get those tapes, and yes, they were responsible.
It kind of
for
validates.
But because sort of in those steps towards sort of as you said, the ideation of suicide, something sort of that you're not recognising internally is going off. Is going askew, and this in a sense is saying, well, the logic behind that askewness in some sense is right, because
or
they are
sense.
responsible. And I guess that's and then of course you have the sort of the truck of actually gaining and generating you actually generating all of this attention around sort of a plot that is actually sort of based on the suicide, and then the offshoots of going further, because I think from memory what was going to be the basis of the next series was actually going to be exploring, because I think 2 of the characters killed themselves or shot.
I think it's okay. The first character, Hannah, dies obviously, but at the end, one of the male characters, Alex, is shot in the head, and it's not said whether he kills himself or not. One of the teachers runs in, because in the series there's this big lawsuit where Hannah's parents are suing the school and all this other stuff, which does not happen in the book at all. And I'm like, the book lacks a lot of depth. But there's one character, and their name is, I believe, Tyler, and his tape basically talks about how he was spying on Hannah, and he was the yearbook photographer, and he was actually outside her house taking photos, and he took a photo of her when she was with another girl, and kind of published it around. So he was kind of really creepy, and he's one of the characters that I actually don't like at all. But he's actually seen with his camera stuff, and he has all these guns underneath all his camera stuff. So I kind of question personally if it's going to go down the route. And then he also is seen in one of the photography rooms taking down the photo of the character Alex. So I'm kind of questioning, one, did you shoot him? And two, with the amount of weapons you have, are you going to go on like your own revenge spree?
Is the second season going to be like a Columbine thing?
Yeah.
Oh my god.
I don't know if I could have the stomach for that.
I mean, I'd watch it, but that's me.
I think that's just about all we have time for today. Thank you, Bodhi, for bringing a youth perspective to us two old people.
Thanks for letting me feel young again.
Thank you, Michelle, as usual.
Thank you, Stephanie.
And we'll see you next time on From the Lighthouse. Thank you.